Good evening, and welcome to tonight's IOP Speaker Series event, Walls Are Witnesses, the Future of Black Chicago. My name is Jordan Parker, and I'm a Master of Public Policy student at the Harris School of Public Policy, the Media and Communications Graduate Assistant at the IOP, and a proud ATLian. When I attended Spelman College, I had the privilege of meeting so many amazing young women from Chicago, specifically the South Side of Chicago. They always made it their privilege to tell me that the JJ's off 47th is better than any JJ's in Atlanta, that walking tacos deserve Michelin stars, and that Chicagoans are essentially God's gift to man. Now, I thought they were bluffing until one day I opened the window of my Bronzeville apartment and I heard the sweet boom cat in 5, 6, 7, 8 of the Bud Billiken Parade. That day, I realized they were right. Walking tacos do deserve Michelin stars. Not because of how they taste, but because the lady down the street was kind enough to sell it to you for $1.50, because it took weeks to clean up the snowball wrappers, because the sound of house music still hums through my windows, because the sun shined extra bright on Gwendolyn Brooks's beloved Bronzeville that warm August day. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome our panelists for what will undoubtedly be a robust and dynamic conversation. Tonika Lewis Johnson is a Chicago native from Inglewood who explores the intersection of art, systemic inequities, policymaking, and community building. We're also happy to welcome her into the IO community as a Pritzker Fellow this quarter. Clap it up. Through groundbreaking projects like Folded Map, Inequity for Sale, and Unblocked Inglewood, she has demonstrated how art can uncover hidden histories and reveal their lasting impact on today's policies, neighborhoods, and communities. Ewing is a Chicago native from Logan Square and the director of undergraduate studies and associate professor in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at UChicago. She is also an author using multi-genre storytelling and other tools of sociological inquiry to interrogate radicalized histories in her writing. If you're into Afrofuturism, you may recognize some of her acclaimed works, Ironheart and Black Panther. Shermann Dilla Thomas is a proud Chicagoan from the South Side, an autodidactic urban historian and lecturer. He has educated the masses on every platform from TikTok to Chicago's community colleges to Meta, Google, and Microsoft. He is newly appointed as the brand ambassador and chief of social media at the DuSable Black History Museum and Education Center. Natalie Moore will serve as our moderator. Natalie is the senior lecturer and director of audio journalism programming at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. Her work centers on segregation and inequality, covering topics like housing, economic development, food injustice, and violence. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. First, please make sure to turn off or silence your cell phones. Second, when it's time for the Q&A, someone will place a microphone in the audience. And as usual, we will give priority for the first questions to students. Finally, please make sure to check out our upcoming IOP events, including Trad Wives and Alpha Males, Gender Relations in the Blender, which will take place on February 11th from 5:30 to 6:45 here in Ida Noise, and The Future of the Democratic Party, which will take place on February 18th from 5:30 to 6:45 at the David Rubenstein Forum. Now please join me in welcoming to the stage Tonika Johnson, Professor Ewing, Dilla, and Natalie Moore.
Music.
We love this walk-on music. I taught my daughter this song. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. It is truly an honor to be on stage with these three. This is truly an all-star panel. So we're going to kiki a little bit, talk about some serious stuff too, but really just reflect on our beloved city. And I'm going to kick it off to Tonika, who has a new book out called Don't Go.
First.
Yes, her first book. And we're going to kick it off with a video to give some context.
Yes. And this is media coverage of my first project, Folded Map. Instead of me trying to just use a whole bunch of time explaining it, I just figured I'll just show you this.
And this morning, we're showing you a new approach to bridging divides in Chicago. Neighborhoods from the city's north and south sides are banding together to take on some very deeply rooted issues. The differences between these communities, they are stark. But as Adriana shows us, together they are tackling segregation and the inequity that comes with it.
Do you have any of those posters left?
Yeah, I do. Chicago residents Nanette Tucker and Wade Wilson share a love of gardening and craft beer. That would be kind of cool.
It would be cool.
They're like neighbors, sort of. Wade is called your map twin. Why are you guys twins?
We're twins because when you fold the map, we touch one another on the map, north and south.
Like many cities, Chicago's a grid with many streets spanning north to south. If you fold a map of the city in half, you can match addresses on the north side with the same block on the south side.
You lived all your life never thinking you had a twin. And now
I have one.
Yes.
They live about 15 miles apart, but Wilson and his wife Jennifer live in the majority white north side neighborhood of Edgewater, while Tucker is in the mostly black south side neighborhood of Englewood.
How would you explain the differences between both of your neighborhoods, which are essentially equidistant from the center, but worlds apart in many ways?
It's very clear that neighborhoods primarily on the north side have had more investment. Everything from the street lighting to grocery stores and restaurants. It's plentiful on the north side and it's not here.
It's almost like you feel a light come on at a certain spot when you're going north. And when you're coming back south, you can feel the gloom that's upon us in Englewood.
Curiosity.
They met through Tonika Lewis Johnson, a social justice artist who grew up in Englewood, a community often in the news.
Two mass shootings on
Shot
Chicago.
in the head this
Drive-by shooting claims the life of a 15-year-old boy in West Englewood.
Lewis Johnson created the Folded Map Project, which includes this film, to change the conversation. She contrasts how the same street, like Ashland Avenue,
they look very different.
looks on the north side
The sidewalks,
and the south side.
the maintenance of the building, none of which have anything to do with gun violence, only disinvestment.
Chicago's segregation is due in part to racist policies like redlining, where banks would designate properties in minority areas, delineated in red, as too risky for mortgage lending, excluding Black Americans from a primary pathway of building wealth, homeownership.
You have neighborhoods that are predominantly Black that have low home ownership as a result of the discriminatory practices. Businesses left, so you don't have a business corridor, so therefore you don't have jobs. And now the schools are starting to fail because they aren't properly funded.
Her solution, bring the North and the South together with map twins.
So we'll come back and talk some more about how Don't Go, your new book, is an extension of the artistic work that you've been doing. But I wanted to start off by asking you all, growing up in Chicago, when did you know Black Chicago was a thing, and is there a childhood moment tied to that? And I'll just say for myself, growing up in Chatham, all right, Chatham. You know, we were not allowed to shop at businesses that weren't Black owned, and that was not a hard thing to do, even though there was a Jewel. Like, there was an actual grocery store on 83rd and King Drive. But this was also the neighborhood, or nearby Soft Sheen was, the Luster family house was there, Johnson Hair Products were there. I grew up in ETA Theater, so it was like a little bit all Black everything. We all knew Soul Train came from Chicago, and we all grew up doing our chores on Saturday morning to Soul Train. So when I think about my Black Chicago cocoon, those are some of the childhood memories and examples that I think of.
You just brought back so many memories. Look, we thinking.
I can start. It's interesting because, so I grew up in Logan Square. I often say I'm a time traveler from a neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore because it's unrecognizable to me. And I was actually born in Avondale. And the year that I was born, I was one of, there were like 70 babies born in Avondale the year that I was born. Sometimes I just look things up in statistics for, for fun. And I was one of 7 Black children born in that community area in that year, right? So I was in this minority. And because Chicago is so segregated and because I took the bus to school, I was very aware of these boundaries. And so for me, Black Chicago was very cultural because I grew up almost entirely around Mexican and Puerto Rican folks. And I was very aware when, like, culturally or spatially, we were with other Black people. And so a couple things that come to mind is like being in the Bud Billiken Day Parade. My Girl Scout troop was, we were on David Orr's float. And so that was one. And then the other thing was, oddly enough, when you asked this question, Natalie, I thought about Moo and Oink. I was waiting to see who was gonna do it, right? Try one more time.
Moo and Oink.
There we go, okay.
There you go.
And knowing that, I remember that early traumatic memory that all of us have of washing in the kitchen and the chitlins walking into the kitchen and somebody's washing chitlins in the sink. And being like just high enough to look up into the sink and then be like, what is that? Like, what's in this bucket? And then being very troubled to find out what was in the bucket. And so that was my sense of like, these are things that we share with other Black people, regardless of where we are. And the flip side of that is, when I got called the N-word for the first time when I was maybe 6 years old on my block. And I never forget that the woman who said this to me, she, called me out my name and then she said, go back to your Jesse Jackson neighborhood. And I was like, wow, that's very specific.
Very specific, that's what I was thinking.
And I went and I had to tell my mother, and this is why whenever people are like, oh, how do I talk to my kids about race? It's like some parents don't get to choose when you talk to your kids about race. Because I had to go, my mom had to explain this to me. And I'll never forget, she said, I wish we lived in Jesse Jackson's neighborhood.
The Highlands.
She said, Jesse Jackson is rich, okay? I wish we lived in his neighborhood. So even in this like traumatic moment, like she wanted to let me know, right, what was what. So those are some of my early odd memories.
I was sure finna say Jesse was balling. So
Right, exactly.
before I answer my question, I want you to sign my book. Let me get my book signed. Since I'm sitting here.
On stage, look at the free, your check is in the mail, my friend.
Right on.
Free advertisement.
I was fortunate enough to be raised by a Chicago police officer, and my dad at one point was vice president of the African American Police League, which was a union inside of the union. It was founded by Howard Sappho and Renault Robinson. And so the second I was born, I knew of a Black Chicago. When I was about 5, I tell this story a lot, I'm sorry if you heard it before. When I was 5, I inadvertently answered the phone when I wasn't supposed to. And this groggily voice says, is this Officer Thomas' house? And I said, yes, sir. And he says, you Officer Thomas' son? I said, yes, sir. He said, tell Officer Thomas I want a number 4. And he hung up. So I go in there bewildered. I'm like 5, 6 years old. Hey, Pops, somebody just said they want a number 4. He starts cussing me out. Oh man, that was my first time being cussed out real good too. But turned out that Mayor Harold Washington, when he was at home, he always had to have 2 bodyguards with him. And so at night, the detail would shrink down to 2. And so if he sent one of them, then it'd create a whole kind of procedural thing. So he would just call the cops that was off duty and tell them to bring over a number 4 for him. And next thing I know, we bring in Mayor Harold Washington, a number 4 from KFC to his house. And so I was keenly aware of 2 Chicagos my entire life. The African American Patrolmen's League, later to be called the African Americans Police League, they fought against, a lady by the name of Pat Hill was suspended because she wore an ankh. And they were like, well, you don't suspend Irish Catholic police who wear crosses.
Right.
Why should she be suspended for an ankh? And so these things were like talked about in my house an awful lot. And then my brother at the time was very much interested in the Nation of Islam and the fruit of Islam. And so, you know, the nation has a lot of history here. And so that was just the conversations in my household. I grew up in Auburn Gresham. I didn't have a white classmate until I was at Eastern Illinois University, right? And that was from preschool all the way to high till I got to college, right? So, you know, our whole lives, there was a big distinction of there's Chicago and then there's Black Chicago. And he would always refer to it as a tale of two cities. And then I ain't being rude, but I want to check my phone and see if I hit the sneaker app for the Jordan 1.
He is serious about this.
It's okay.
Do it. You should.
I'm worried.
You can do that while Tonika tells her story.
Yes, you could go ahead. I won't be insulted. I would say for me, I have a very distinct memory of feeling like, oh, Black Chicago, it's a thing. Now, a lot of you all are probably too young to know this show, but it was a public access show called The Awakening.
I knew you were going to say The Awakening.
The Awakening. So I went to grammar school with one of the main characters. Her name was
But you got to explain what The
Tonika.
Awakening is.
It was, I mean, I don't even know how to explain it. It was a drama series that was...
It was a Black Christian-based teenage soap opera. With
That's what it
drama.
was.
And what was the lead girl's name? And
Marquita, but her best friend was named Tonika. Yeah. And so this is my connection to it. So the character Tonika, that was my like childhood close friend named Star McNabb. And she told me, because she went to the church that actually, you know, helped produce it.
It was on 79th and Western.
Yes. And so she told me, I wanted to use your name for this church production that we're gonna do. And I was like, oh, okay. And then when it came out, I was like, that's Tonika? She said they didn't want to use Tonika, they wanted to use Tonika. But yeah, so when that aired.
That's kind of peak Chicago.
That is. So I knew that show was something because we would go to the skating rink every Saturday. And
which rink were you going to? The rink?
I was going to the rink, but I will also go to the north side because I was, you know, a skater when I was younger. So I went to Rainbow.
You went to Rainbow.
Exactly.
RIP.
Yeah. And the way that us Black kids, not even teenagers yet, was talking about this show, and we were not from the same neighborhood at all. That's when I was like, okay, we're all tapped into something that I know everybody else is not aware of. That and Elman Company, that was the dance show.
If you want to go down the rabbit hole, The Awakening is on YouTube.
Yeah.
I want to stay with you, Tonika. Tell us about your new book.
My new book. My first book ever. So as a multimedia artist, meaning that my first project, Folded Map, it really included photography. And then in that project, I even expanded to video. And I also knew that I didn't want to continue doing video. But when you are essentially a storyteller, like all of us, and you realize that some mediums are not big enough for the stories that you want to tell. And the story that I wanted to tell was the one that I was coming to terms with as I was giving presentations about Folded Map and having the opportunity to even travel overseas to talk about my work, is that I would just ask, I just started asking, how many of you all, and we'll do it today, raise your hand if you have heard or have been told that the south side of Chicago is dangerous and that you should not go. Keep them raised, raise them high. Now everybody look around. You can put them down, that's everybody. Every time I would ask that question, whether it was predominantly white audience, predominantly Black audience, like everyone heard this narrative. And it really struck me one day when I asked a group of Northwestern freshmen, and most of them were young, white, 18, 19-year-olds. Most of them were not from Chicago, from other smaller Midwest cities, and they all raised their hands. And as a parent, and my children were not that much younger than them, I just felt really sad because I was like, wow, they're coming to this amazing city, this diverse city, and they have no clue that this advice they're given is one, preventing them from discovering such an amazing city, but also they have no idea how racist it is. They're just gonna listen to this advice for however long because of safety. And they're going to create this bubble for themselves. And so that really bothered me to the point that when I went overseas to talk about my work, was invited overseas, this little, in Bordeaux, France, small place, you know, and I said Chicago, and I said South Side, and all of them were like, oh, boo, boo, boo.
Wow.
I said, well, okay, now I gotta do something. And so it was at that moment that I knew I wanted to collect stories from people who have been told to not go. And of course, that was going to be a lot of transplants. It was going to be a lot of white people. And I wanted to see if they were willing to share their story so that they can contribute to this conversation about segregation in a way that is also informing the rest of us, being honest about how long you took that advice, the situation you were in when you were given that advice, and what you realized about yourself and race when you did go. And so that's really what the book is. It's a collection of Chicagoan stories who are being honest about how young the programming to believe Black neighborhoods are bad, how young they were when it began, and then also of Chicagoans like myself who are from neighborhoods that people were told to not go to, how it made us feel when we first encountered it. And so I knew that collecting those stories when I was doing the interviews with my co-author, sociologist Dr. Maria Creason, I knew, I was like, this can't be an art exhibit. This can't be just photos with, you know, the audio stories. I really wanted people to sit with it beyond just the walls of a gallery and, you know, online. And so that's when the idea for the book came about. So that's what Don't Go is, you know, a way for us to just defend Chicago and have something to give people who might say that, who might challenge us. But this book is specifically about people getting told that.
And you can buy it at 57th Street Books, Seminary Co-op.
Yes, yes, and everywhere books are sold online.
Yes, support local booksellers when you do that.
Yes, for sure.
This is hot off the press. It comes
not even
out
off
on
the press.
Tuesday.
That's the bootleg.
It's still getting pressed. It's getting pressed right now.
Yeah. I got socks, oils, and bootleg books.
On Tuesday, Original Sins, the miseducation of Black and Native children and the construction of American racism. Eve, tell us about it.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm still geeked off the last book we just heard of. But, and I want to say really quickly, I don't know, I actually haven't finished it yet, but have you all heard the podcast, You Ain't Seen Nothing?
Yes.
Right. And so
won a Pulitzer last year.
Just casual, right? So if you haven't checked it out yet, it's about the brutal beating of Leonard Clark, and it was put together by our good friends and colleagues at the Invisible Institute. And I just want to mention that because it makes me think about how when I hear don't go, I think about places like Bridgeport that we were told don't go, right? And that was like borne out by actual material circumstance of like really bad things that could happen to you, that did happen to young people our age. And yet, again, some people don't have the luxury of letting that shape their entire worldview. So anyway, my book, what is this book about? So this book is the one that's taken me the longest to write. And it is about how many of us have asked and, you know, pondered year after year of why don't schools work? Why don't schools work? Why don't schools work specifically for students of color, and specifically, as I talk about in this book, for Black and Native youth? And basically the book is saying that actually schools work great. They are doing exactly what they were designed to do. Basically I talk about how, as we know at this point, although many people will prefer us to not know and not talk about it, the country that we live in is founded on indigenous genocide and chattel slavery. Those are the two original sins of this United States. There is no United States as we know it without the kidnapping and brutalization of Black people from Africa. There is no United States as we know it without the theft of land and accompanying murder of indigenous peoples that were the first stewards of this land. And so schools are not places that are just like sitting idly by as all this is happening, but basically are places where the idea that Black and Native children are not really children, or not really human, that Black and Native people are not really human, gets normalized, perpetuated, and maintained. And I have like 1 million receipts and examples. There are almost 1,000 citations in the book.
I was looking at your footnotes.
You know why? Because I couldn't have people come in and just like, I had to come correct. Because it's a big claim. I couldn't have people come and be like, well, how do you know, right? And so I have a lot of receipts. Good. So that's what the book is about. It is, I have been told that it is not boring, not hard to read. Esquire refers to it as my signature bracing prose. I really like that. Sounds dope. And then, and it's not like all dire. So at the end, I talk a lot about what we can do to kind of reimagine what education can look like. And also like, our entire history is full of examples of people who have always done this in insurgent ways against the violence of the state. So yeah, that's the book. You can also get it wherever books are sold.
And you can pre-order it in the lobby as well as order Tonika's book in the lobby. I want to ask all of you this question, but I'll start with you, Dilla. Dilla, what Chicago thinkers, artists, scholars, block club presidents, anyone influence your work, or that you feel like your work is in conversation with?
I'll start with influence. It's really hard to be like, I'm on such and such level, right? I'm sitting up here with some authors and I'm thinking, bro, you gotta write a book, man. You tripping. You gotta get your book game up. I'm really inspired by Father Michael Flager, who's the pastor of St. Sabina and Arbin Gresham, you know. This Irish kid that could have, he's a really bright guy, could have been anything he wanted, could be anywhere he wants, and yet he's the reason why you can't buy a handgun inside of Chicago, right? You gotta go somewhere else to do it. So I'm very much inspired by him. I'm inspired greatly by this guy by the name of Earl B. Dickerson. I talk about him as often as I can. Earl B. was the man, he's the first Black dude to graduate from this institution's law school. And, you know, just spoke truth to power all the time. I'm certainly inspired by the people that I'm sitting next to and the work that they've been doing and continue to do. I'm inspired by Jamal Cole and the things that he's been able to do with my block, my hood, my city, or you know, Rami that runs Inner City Muslim Action Network is a really, really dope guy. Really hard to say who I think I'm on par with, but what I do know and recognize.
It's not on par in conversation, like who your work is speaking to.
Like in comparison to someone who does something similar historically or that kind of thing, right?
Or not, I mean, however.
What my work speaks to is anyone in Chicago's history who tried to make storytelling and history accessible, right? There's sometimes in instances of research, right, and finding those citations and doing that work, it might cost you some money, or you might need to be tapped into a certain network, right? You know, one of the ways that I do a lot of research on folks is I try to seek out their obituary, because the obituary is where ain't nobody finna lie about you. You ain't here to check on them. They are not finna tell any stories on your behalf. And so if I really want to know, you know, if you're a Black migrator, right, what city did your folks come from, or who you're related to, or your family, right, I'm seeking out the obituary. And if you were, you know, you're alive and you passed away in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there's a good chance those obituaries are in the newspapers. Then as soon as I start down that track, now I got to pay $29.99 to subscribe, to get into the archives, right? And so what I'm doing with my work is, because I'm fortunate enough to have the $29.99, is to get that information out and then put it in the public sphere for free, so that everybody is able to kind of take in that information, right? Because it should be for others. And so that's really, you know, anyone that's in that conversation, anyone that wants to make sure that learning is accessible, but then also that there isn't just this one kind of way to do things, right? You can use social media as a tool to educate, to inspire, to push for change in policy. and things like that.
I just want to shout out the Vivian Harsh collection.
I was thinking that too, yeah.
Right on.
Yes.
At Carter G. Woodson, they have a collection of Black funeral home death names. So just offering that in your obituary work.
The historian in me must tell you that Vivian Harsh is Chicago's first Black librarian.
Yeah.
And she worked at the George Cleveland Hall Library branch. And we refer to her as the historian who didn't write because she didn't write any books. But what she did do was exactly what Sister Natalie is talking about. If there were books written by marginalized people, women, people of color, that only got published or printed that one time, she scoured the earth for them so that we could have these books for time moving forward. So, you know, I'm in conversation with Sister Harsh.
Yes.
You know
Okay,
That's
there
right.
you go.
Right.
Eve?
Oh man, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, Vivian Harsh. And I think that, yeah, anyway, people should go to the Harsh Archives. It's free, it's open to the public. It's Chicago Public Library. It's at the Carter G. Woodson Regional Branch on 95th and Halsted. My first automatic answer is always Gwendolyn Brooks, predictably, because she's so important to me and changed my life in terms of what it means to be a writer. Gwendolyn Brooks gave me this model of a writer as like a person in community, a person in your neighborhood, a person who owes things to other people, with so many choices that she made, everything from just like sponsoring poetry contests for young people in elementary schools and high schools in Chicago to actually like speaking at, CPS graduation. She used to speak at Jenner every year at their graduation, to keeping up correspondence with people all across the country. And the idea that the writer has a kind of like community obligation is really important to me, and something that she's an important role model of mine for that reason. And also like the idea of even the title, A Street in Bronzeville, the idea that the world outside your window is worth talking about, that all of us have stories worth telling, that poetry is not the province of a select few set of people. So that's my like first answer, but I will say as I was listening to Dilla talk and just thinking about the question, I also, I want to shout out Lorraine Hansberry as well. Because like she did so much in such a short life. And I oftentimes, when people ask me like, oh, how do you find time to do this or publish this? My real answer, which is like kind of morbid, but this is just to be like, keep it a buck. My real answer is that I know that I have a finite number of days on this earth. And as I draw my last breath, either the things that I wanted to say and do got done or they didn't. And I'm gonna die regardless. And so like, there's no in between. And there's no other way for those things to get out of your head, out of your heart, into the world, except for you to produce them. Every day I ask myself, is there some way that I could just stare at a computer and through osmosis, like these, no, unfortunately I have to write them. And Lorraine Hansberry reminds me of that because she passed away in her mid-30s, right? And so I'm older now than all the years that she ever had on this earth, and she gave us so much during that time. And so I think about her a lot. Also, like, on the low, when I was in college, I took a class called Black Women Writers of the 40s and 50s, and it was, I think, the first time I saw this set of photos of Lorraine Hansberry that you've probably seen, where she's just standing in her office in front of like, her typewriter and all that stuff. And she just looked cool. I was like, I just want to be cool like her. Like, she's just dope. And then one more I'll say is Harold. That Harold Washington is, really like one of the first sort of household heroes. I think the way a lot of people now think about the Obamas, or I don't know, maybe people in some of my elementary school teachers, they used to talk about how their families talk about like JFK, right? Like Harold was, Harold Washington, sorry. He just stood as such a titan of what Chicago could be. My parents' first date was a Harold Washington fundraiser. Two people that should not have been together, but I'm glad to have been born. So that's, like, shout out to that. It's not a great, it's not an awesome love story, but I am happy that I exist, so that's dope for me. But yeah, so like even my very existence, and what he stood for, in the Chicago that he believed was possible, that he believed could exist during a time that was like really grim in terms of people, like the factions and the racism and just the stuff that, I mean, people will call in his office like making monkey noises and stuff. I mean, like it was just really virulent racism, and the way him as an orator, as a writer, as a storyteller, as a scholar, like the way he spoke, the way he dropped game, right? Like just all of that, I think is just, I find so inspiring. And he's the kind of person that you can never get enough of him. So if people in this room, if you feel like you don't know enough about Harold Washington, there's actually a really, really good This American Life episode that I believe is just called Harold, that you should check out. I love the people in the front taking notes, you're great. Also on the 5th floor of the Harold Washington Library, which is probably my single most favoriteest place in Chicago. I consider it to be my personal office. On the top floor, behind the Winter Garden, there's a hallway of like Harold Washington archives that you can also check out that are like his books and his notes and stuff in cases. So yeah, become a scholar of Harold. He's amazing. And I still believe in the Chicago that he believed in, contrary to all available evidence.
Well, yeah, perfect segue into my Chicagoan. It was actually Harold Washington's very young press secretary, Laura Washington.
Yes.
She is my like guiding light. I was introduced to her when I was 18. I majored in journalism at Columbia College, and my internship was at the Chicago Reporter. Very small nonprofit publication that focused on race, politics, and poverty. And not only Laura Washington, but the staff at that particular time, stellar. Alden Laurie. Okay, you look all of these people up. He was one of the writers for the Cost of Segregation report with MPC. He was a staff reporter at the time. Then you have Alicia Tate. Then you have Sarah Karp. So I was around all of these amazing, not only reporters, but investigative reporters that were led by Laura Washington. And when people ask me, well, how did you come up with a project like Folded Map? The story is mine, yes, but what Laura and being an intern and it being my first like office job at the Chicago Reporter taught me is how to get data, how to ask questions that people have not asked yet to reveal the information that is hidden. And they would get FOIAs, they would make requests for information that did not exist yet, that was not in a report yet. And they would comb through information and map it. And at the end of it, it was very clear. So I saw them do that over and over with Laura Washington as the leader and as the editor. And it just really made an impression on me. I was like, oh, you can tell these stories not only by writing about them, investigating them, but visually as well as photography. So that was really where I learned so much. And, she also came to my wedding and introduced me to other amazing Chicagoans, like another Black woman writer, Leonida McLean. She gave her book of essays to me. She's an amazing essayist who was a reporter as well in Chicago. You should check her out.
She worked at the Tribune, A Foot in Both Worlds is the name of her
Leonida McLean. And then also my photography mentor, Ovi Carter, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning photojournalist with the Tribune. He helped me understand the importance and the role of photography and photographers in Chicago and how Black staff photographers were assigned to stories for the paper, but they would stay in neighborhoods and take photos, and that's how you actually got a lot of the historic photography of Chicago, because of those Black photographers who stayed and documented the community in a way that really was lost in the early 2000s. So those two for me.
Well, Laura gave me my first internship.
Oh, she did?
Yeah.
Love her.
Okay, so speaking of data, there are a lot of myths about Chicago. We know that there has been population loss, but where are they going? And this idea of a reverse migration really grates me because As Isabel Wilkerson says, nothing will ever compare to the Great Migration. And to call something a reverse migration is just wrong. But Eve, I know that you brought some receipts. I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Well, so I had to prepare some things, partially because one of the reasons I was excited about this panel, and I'm glad that we're not only talking about data and all that type of stuff, but I will say that I'm so inspired by what both of y'all are talking about in terms of going to the archives, going to the maps, because I think that that is also part of the power of Black Chicago, is knowing that we have to do that digging ourselves. And so a few years ago, right before the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, my research team and myself, we embarked on a project of interviewing or doing focus groups with 80 Black Chicagoans about why they were either considering leaving Chicago or why their loved ones had left Chicago. And we wanted to do this because there were a lot of narratives that we saw circulating in the media about, this reverse Great Migration. And I was saying to Natalie before we started, I think some of that is because if one or two people had that story of oh, I went back to Atlanta or I went back to Dallas to seek a better life, that is a very nice narrative, right? Mm-hmm. But if you think about it, the people that are most on the receiving end of a lot of the injustice in Chicago are not people that have the means to up and move, right? Moving is expensive. Moving is expensive in the state. The means, the social networks to move out of state. So, so in a couple things, basically from 2000 to 2019, first 2 decades of this century, Chicago's population overall went down by 7%, but the number of Black Chicagoans went down by 25%. Okay, so that's the first number to drop in. The second thing is that when people do move out of Chicago, white residents are more likely to move to affluent areas of the region. Black residents are more likely to move to areas with less economic opportunity, including sometimes poor performing schools, right? Poor outcomes with employment and things like that. And so as Amanda Lewis, who's a professor at UIC, says, most Black Chicagoans are leaving Illinois and moving to Illinois, right? They're moving to immediate surrounding suburbs that are more affordable, or they might be moving to Northwest Indiana. And one other thing that I want to throw in is that if you look at, one of the things we did was we pulled the statistics on, at the beginning of the year 2000, there were 14 cities in the US that had the largest populations of Black residents, okay? Of those 14 cities, 20 years later, the 3 that had the biggest drops in Black residents in that 20 years were Chicago, New Orleans, and Detroit. So of these, New Orleans and Detroit, we can think about very specific factors, very specific disasters, cataclysms, right? Not only historic for those cities, but for the United States, right? Katrina, cataclysm, right? The decline of the auto industry in Detroit, right? Very specific things. So that leads me to think about, what is the equivalent disaster in Chicago? Right? What is our version of that, right? Right. And it turns out that it's all these things, right? It's everything compiled. And so in this paper we wrote, I refer to it as a slow motion disaster, which is a term from public health. But basically it's all the stuff, right? It's everything. It's the schooling, it's the housing, it's the physical violence, it's the environmental racism. It's all of that weighs on people year after year. And so if folks want to check out that paper, it's free. You don't need a license or a subscription or anything like that. It's in a paper called Socius, and if you Google my name, and the title is No Future for Black People in Chicago, which is a quote from one of our participants. We asked everybody, what do you think is the future for Black people in Chicago? People would say, I don't see one. And so I think that it's important. Number one, that's part of, I feel like my research role as a storyteller is to ask people, actually show up and ask people things and figure out where the patterns are. But number two, what do we do, and where's the possibility for us to think about where we intervene in those trends so that people can see that future? And what is our version of undoing, those disasters that have been befallen us? Sorry to be a bummer.
No. And did you find, and this is a very small sample of talking to peers, but I find that even Black Chicagoans will internalize the messaging that we hear about our city. I'm outside a lot. There's so much in this amazing city, right? Black and otherwise. How could you not, love all the things right. that this place has, whether it's and things that don't always cost money.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think about that, and I think about this narrative too that I hear about suburbs are better, and that Black folks are not immune to that American dream.
Absolutely.
Of wanting to be in a Flossmoor or an Olympia Fields or a generation prior a Calumet City, because it was seen as opportunity. And Chicago is just so awful, and I hear that a lot, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Yes, like these things are true about parking tickets, okay?
Right.
And red light cameras.
And the
but,
boot man.
Right, the boot.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? A lot of people we spoke to said, a lot of them said, we love Chicago. I love Chicago. I want to stay. Actually, a lot of them said that they felt very guilty if they even thought about moving from Chicago, and that it was seen to be an obligation that you're supposed to stick around forever. But it's really the nuts and bolts things of like, can I get a job? Can I afford rent? Can I send my child to a school that meets their needs without having to travel across the city or like fight for the resources that they need? You mentioned Sarah Karp. Sarah Karp did some amazing reporting a few years ago on the private fundraising that different schools do.
I did
right?
that story.
I'm sorry, now.
We did.
No, you did the
We did it together.
You did it together. I'm sorry.
I'm like, girl, these fundraisers, because I'm on the PTA now. Like, what is?
I'm sorry.
Seeing
blame my head, not my heart. Blame my head.
Seeing
not my
the
heart.
disparities of a Northside school PTA raising $100,000
that they don't get.
And we are trying to get some popcorn, double good.
And $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, right? As Natalie Moore reported, as we all know, as we all heard me say, y'all heard me say it was Natalie and Sarah. And so, you know, those are the kinds of things where within one school district, right? My students and I, we talked about today, the suspension and expulsion within CPS. There are schools that are basically suspending hardly any students. There are schools that are suspending 2/3, 80% of their students every year. And so these are the things that people say, I love it here, I want to stay, but the material stakes have to change. We need the TIF money, we need the fundraising, right? And so I think that that's where all of us have a role to play in what are those demands that we're making of leadership and of one another to make sure those material needs are met for everybody.
And let's not skip over, Northwestern did a study that they said from 1980 till about today that over 380,000 Black folks have been displaced from Chicago. Because anytime there's a need for land, the land grab happens in Black and brown spaces, right? You know, I would refer to the knocking down of the State Street corridor as a land grab, right? You know, what was the name of the projects that was over there off of Cicero when you on your way to
LeClaire Courts.
LeClaire Courts. LeClaire Courts happens to be the first housing project in the history of this country where the residents received a Ford Foundation grant, and they were trained to then manage their own facilities. And as soon as they handed it over to them, things changed in LeClaire Courts. The violence went down. They came up with after-school programs, and it was like right as they figured it out, it's like, oh no, we're gonna need this right quick. And they take this land, right? Tons of housing projects, something to the, pretty close to 500,000 Black folks in the last 45 years have been displaced from Chicago via land grabs. And then you add on to the fact that their hospitals get taken for land grabs, right? Look, the reason why Michael Reese Hospital isn't standing is for a failed Olympic bid that we didn't have a chance in hell in winning in the first place, right? So all those things got to be discussed too when we're talking about a so-called reverse migration. It's a lot of people being forced out, right? And those communities, as much as we want to look at projects as this negative thing, they fostered amazing communities. And yes, there was some crime, but crime doesn't just appear, right? It happens because of a lack of something. And on the flip side of that, it's so many stories of some girl got accepted to college, and it's the people in the projects that, galvanize and make sure that she gets sent off to that because she represents them. And that also is the tale of why there's so much leaving going on. And then like you stated, there's this internalization that other spaces are better, right? But then almost to a man, right? I'm a dude in his 40s, and I grew up with a lot of guys that grew up in the city with me. Now a lot of them are raising their families in the suburbs. And what are our phone conversations? Man, my taxes higher than my damn mortgage. This is ridiculous. What about our phone conversations? Man, your basement didn't flood, Dilla? Well, no, I live in the city. My basement is pretty solidly good. Right. You moved yourself out there in the sticks where they didn't have any kind of infrastructure set up, right? And so every time it rains, the reservoir backs up in your house, right? And then not just that, you moved out there for the American dream, but then what happens when your 16-year-old son gets his license and he's pulled over on Salt Trail Road, or he's pulled over on Lincoln Highway? You missed the hell out of 79th Street then, right? So.
One of my participants that we interviewed said, the devil knows everybody's zip code.
Yeah, that part.
So.
That part.
We will turn to questions now, but I do want to ask this one final question, if any of you feel comfortable asking. I just feel like we have to talk about the future of Black Chicago. We've talked about, moving out, not using the term migration in the same way, but migration is changing the composition of Chicago with Venezuelans and Colombians, and these, I don't think that they may consider themselves Black, but they are dark-skinned folks, and they are moving into Black South Side neighborhoods in particular. I know that we've seen one impact is that they're repopulating some schools that that might be on the chopping block for closure. But what impact do you think this type of migration will have on Black Chicago neighborhoods?
I think it's up to us, right? And I think we need to, I always say, please stop using the oppressor's playbook, right? They didn't draw those plays up for your benefit. And so this regurgitation of the Haitians are taking from you or the Venezuelans are taking from you is a straight up lie. And what I think Black Chicago should be doing is partnering, organizing with them. Then you're going to create this amazing thing called a voters block. Then that voters block is going to be able to push policy that's in your benefit. And when you think about it, they want the same things. I was a part of a documentary for one of these stations where we talked about the history of migrants and how it's the Chicago way for the newest migrant to be treated the worst, right? And I think having us and the Mexican homies are the last new arrivals that kind of got that treatment. Those of us families who come from the Great Migration and the brown homies who come here for better opportunities. And I think us in particular should be partnering with the Venezuelans and the Haitians and organizing with them and helping them as much as we can because we got shared interests. Because at the end of the day, those who are empowered are using the standard tactic of divide and conquer. So for the sustainability of Black Chicago, for there to be a Black Chicago in 2125, we need to be partnering with them in a major way.
All right, we have about 15 minutes for questions. I don't know if there's a mic. Yes.
There's a mic over there, they tell me. Yeah. While y'all walk, I'm gonna check the Jordans.
There'll be students.
Did we get them?
Yeah, we're prioritizing students. Right.
Hello. First and foremost, I just want to thank you all so much for coming here to speak. This discussion is really filling my heart as a young Black boy from the south side of Chicago, from Washington Heights, from 106 in Peoria. I'm very full having you all here. I don't even need to eat dinner. I'm so full.
Oh, yeah. We want you to eat, though.
I'm taking this class with Professor Ewing right now, shameless plug, a professor, called Race in American Public Schools. If you are an undergraduate, please take that school. Please take that class. It's actively changing my life right now.
Thank you, Charles.
My question is that having attended Columbia College Chicago, Ms. Johnson, and you, Mr. Dilla, having attended Northeastern, and you, Professor Ewing, having attended the University of Chicago, how have you all, having attended these PWIs and coming from this very Black paradigm of education in your homes that you all echoed earlier in this discussion, how did that influence your interaction with academia and with the version of Chicago you wore on y'all's sleeves every time you went to class every day? How were you able to show that, and how did that education influence the work you do today?
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Columbia is a private white institute.
I didn't think of Columbia College that way. I meant Columbia College, Chicago, and I never thought about it that way. I just had to clarify that. But I'm just thinking about your question.
I felt, why are you thinking? I felt
Go ahead.
a responsibility when I got down to Charleston to, I felt it wasn't solely on me to like erase the myth that ignorant folks had about Chicago or Black Chicago, but I also knew that there were going to be people coming behind me, right? And there still is Black kids from Chicago going down to Eastern, and so I wanted to show that you can be a dude that, has some fresh Dickies on and some J's and still compete with the other students, right? I participated in the Student Senate. I participated in various organizations. I made sure I was on the homecoming planning committee because y'all gonna have some Black stuff up in here too. And I felt it was my duty that when Chicago came up, instead of thinking about the gangs, you thought about Dilla as a representation of Chicago. And so that's really how I carried it at college. Anybody that went to college with me, they always tell me that. They're like, man, you was quintessential Chicago, bro. And you helped me rethink of how I thought about Chicago. And then it happened in the reverse too, right? Coming from a Black space, you build up these walls. You have these concepts about other races and other ethnicities. And one of my best friends in the world right now is this Amish dude named John who came from Arcola. I had my thoughts about the Amish or the Irish or the Italian. One of my roommates was Frankie Sanders. I thought his uncle was in the mob, and come to find out, Frankie had the same way I didn't want people to think that every Black dude is in the gang. Frankie despised the fact that as soon as he was walked in as an Italian guy, you were going to say Al Capone or Lucky Luciano to him, right? And so I also learned that I had some prejudices that I had to reverse too, and so it ended up being a net beautiful thing.
Since you mentioned the Jays, did you win?
I did not,
I'm
G.
sorry, man. I'm sorry. Next time. There's always next year.
Oh man, I'm so crushed.
Thank you for that question. It was so, I went here as, I went to CPS my whole life, and then I came here as an undergrad, yay. And then I came here as an undergrad, and man, the culture shock. So first of all, a lot of the language that people have now about first gen, that was not, people in the back are like, absolutely not. That was not a language that people used. And the cultural dissonance I felt of being in my city, but so being at home, but so away from home was extraordinarily painful. I remember I walked into the lobby one day of my dorm, and the Sun-Times, they used to have the newspaper out every day. And there was this headline about how something from my graduating class, something like 8 Black students had gone to, the top whatever, elite universities. And that made me feel horrible, right? And I think that for me, the biggest disconnect was the way people talked about Hyde Park, which was, dangerous. The South Side is dangerous. I was like, this is by far the nicest, safest place I've ever lived in my life, right? I was like, the day-to-day fear that I grew up with, the little part of my brain that was always like, how do I get home safe? How's my brother doing? We got to go on this corner, walk on this street, don't walk here, walk home in the middle of the street so that you can see, nobody can, you know what I mean? That I didn't feel like I had to deal with that here. And I was like, wow, we are so, the fact that you think this is dangerous is I don't even know where to begin. And then the other thing was that UChicago at the time had this thing where they referred to Chicago as the university. And I was like, no. Chicago is a city. You don't get to appropriate that, right? You don't get to steal that and represent that. So it was really tough. And honestly, I think, not to just be super emotional in front of everybody, but that is part of, when you say, how does it impact the work that I do? It's part of why I find it so rewarding and meaningful to teach here and have students like you. And it's because, anything that I can do to make your experience different than mine, means a lot to me. And for those that don't know, I am blessed to have just the coolest, smartest, most hardworking students ever. They're so amazing, and I'm so proud of them. And so that's very rewarding and special to me.
I would say for me, I obviously grew up in Inglewood, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood, but a lot of my childhood and teenage experiences prior to Columbia College were really diverse. And it's probably because I grew up in a family full of artists. I was always around people from different backgrounds, different races, who had a shared passion as either my uncles who were visual artists. My mom was a screenwriter. She helped establish a small group called Black Screenwriters Association in the 90s. And so I was all over Chicago. So by the time I got to Columbia College, that was the first time that I had experienced being the only Black person in a class. And since that class was photography, it offered a very different kind of conversation and introduction to me seeing how transplants to Chicago viewed Chicago, the documentation of Black people, the representation of Black people. And I learned at Columbia College what people in other small Midwestern cities and even just cities across the nation who came to Chicago to pursue art, photography, or journalism, what they thought about Chicago. And not only did it piss me off, but it really made me feel sorry for them. And it really made me see and identify the benefit and the beauty of being not only from this city, but also from a Black neighborhood. And it really showed me that, oh my gosh, they're here to learn this specific craft and don't understand how limited their worldview is and how that's really going to translate and show up in their work. And so for me, that was the realization I had, experiencing Columbia College and coming into contact with people who were new to Chicago and had very strong opinions and views about what Chicago is. And it helped me affirm why Chicago is great and how much I receive from this city and how much I learned from the people here, and really, how sad it is that, they were being programmed to be stifled in a way.
I think we went that side first. We'll go that side.
Yeah, over here.
You could see through those lights.
Yeah, about to say,
Yeah.
right.
Hi.
It's like ring lights.
My name is Syra. I'm a fourth year, double majoring in business economics and race, diaspora, and indigeneity. And I just had a statement and a question. So at this institution, and like many others, we get so focused on theory and academia when a lot of the time, arguably, like academia is only ever catching up with what the people are doing on the ground.
Talk about it.
And I think like Chicago thinkers, which is a term I use broadly to encompass people like you all on stage, who I consider my own personal historian, Saida, who is somewhere over there, are people who are like telling me like what Chicago is, what Chicago has been for so many Black people. And it's making me rethink my own relationship and come to terms with my own city. And if you know me, me and my hometown, I do not like to claim her a lot. And so, but it's through like this radical love of how Black people view Chicago that I'm seeing that wherever Black people go, there's a story to be told. And so basically I say all of this because we get focused on the outputs of like Chicago, if we're thinking Mild Sauce, if we're thinking the books that you guys have created, I'm wondering like, what is it that you guys think this Black radical relationship from Chicago comes from? Because we get focused on, we produce this, we produce that, but there's something more without any product. There's something that Black Chicago clearly has, and it's radical to me inherently. And so I'm wondering, where do you guys think that comes from?
It's in the water.
We're a portal.
I think spaces have energies, and I think that we all kind of leave a trace of that energy around. That energy then permeates and finds itself a new host. And so, being a city that's by and large founded by what we would refer to as a Black man certainly sets us on that trend, right? The other thing is, when you have so many people against you, a lot of times it makes you like circle the wagons, and then you have this proximity to greatness. And so then you're in arm's reach of all these amazing thought leaders and innovators, and then it makes it easier for that next generation to come up with that same thing. So I just think it's really, really in the water and in the air, you know, out of necessity in a lot of ways.
Okay, take another question over here.
Hey y'all, I'm Shawnee, and I just want to
We
start.
can't see y'all, by the way, like the lighting is.
I'm sorry y'all are being blinded. I just want to say first how much of an honor it is to just exist at the same time in the same space and be from the same city as you all. I have looked up to you all for many different reasons, and I'm just thankful to be here. But my question is, I think as a Black person from the south side of the city, my grandmother has been in her house for 30 years. Her parents were from Arkansas and Mississippi. I have seen the extreme faith and the extreme optimism of my people here in this city. I have seen the creativity and the artistry, and a lot of times in our neighborhoods, there's not always a lot of spaces to pour that creativity. And so my question is mostly, how can we mind map and cultivate spaces where we don't have to travel so far outside of ourselves and outside of the pockets of the city that we live in to see what we want to see, have leisure for our elders, for ourselves and our young people? How can we cultivate more equity in our own neighborhoods, in our own backyards? It's a big question, sorry. Okay.
It's a big question, and I appreciate it. Thank you, Shawnee. But it is going to require for people to, for Black people to really think differently about the neighborhoods that we have just talked about. Leaving Chicago, leaving specific neighborhoods, the reasons that we're leaving, and really figure out the opportunity that exists and transforming the way we view our own neighborhoods. I'll give you an example with Inglewood. There's people who left Inglewood because of the disinvestment, the violence that it experienced in the 80s and 90s specifically. But now you have, it's a neighborhood that has so many vacant lots. It's a neighborhood that has, that is the poster child of everything wrong. And really, I love using my neighborhood as an example to challenge people to think differently, not just about Inglewood alone, but Black spaces that have been taken advantage of, that have been disinvested in. Like, what is assess our own responsibility to bring those neighborhoods and spaces back up. And in order to do that, you have to understand local government. In order to do that, you have to understand history, because that is the way that you're going to be able to figure out communal economics. And it really is what we have to do. We have, grandmother's house. I think we were just talking about that in the green room. People who don't value the fact that your grandmother has lived in weathered the storm of 30 years of ownership of that house, and people might not want to, in your family might want to maintain it, but really helping transform the way they value that. It's not just grandmother's house. Think about what it can be, and all of the opportunities that could exist just with you young people and your friends. You don't have to pursue home ownership alone. Chicago has an amazing housing stock of 2 flats and 3 flats, and a part of organizing is seeing how you can create new models amongst yourselves. Go in together to get, a 2 or 3 flat. Whoever has the best credit, create a pool for that down payment. It doesn't have to be the way in which we were traditionally taught how to acquire generational wealth. And this is why I love Chicago, because it has so many opportunities for us to test out new models, new ways of contributing to your own community, building generational wealth. So I would just say, to just use this time in your youth to think about what you all can do together, and do not minimize the value of Black neighborhoods just because of where it exists in regards to schools and low home ownership and not having the amenities, because someone has to stay. Someone has to stay to do the kind of investments that you're talking about. But I just really want you all to feel encouraged to know that you can do it. You can do it. Just start small. Start small with your group of friends.
Well, that is where we will end it this evening.
Thank you, Natalie.
Tonika. Thank you, Dilla. Thank you, E.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being an engaging audience.